famous pianist tried to mock a blind boy in front of everyone. But the moment the boy played the first note, the entire theater fell silent, and what followed, no one ever forgot. The velvet seats were packed, the air tinged with perfume, and the low hum of polite conversation filled the theater. It was the annual Harmony for Hope Gala in Boston, an elegant evening where donors mingled and the renowned pianist Richard Holden was set to close the night. His name was printed in gold foil across the program, and people had flown in just to watch him perform. Backstage, though, the mood shifted when an unexpected guest arrived. A boy, maybe 12 or 13, walked in holding tightly to his mother's arm. He was blind. That much was clear. The boy's cane tapped softly against the hallway floor, and his face tilted upward as if searching the space through sound alone. Word spread quickly. He would be playing tonight, just before Holden's final act. An anonymous donor had arranged it. When Richard caught sight of the boy being led toward the grand piano, his smile turned thin. He walked on stage with exaggerated grace, greeted the audience, then, with just enough volume for the front rows to hear, offered the boy his seat at the piano. "Why don't we give our young guest the spotlight?" he said, as if it were an act of charity. Some chuckled nervously. The boy said nothing, only nodded and took the bench. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as the boy placed his fingers on the keys. Then he played the first note. It rang out, not timid or unsure, but full, bold, like a breath held too long, finally released. The room went still. Even Holden froze. And within seconds, every eye and ear in the theater belonged to the boy no one had expected, not even the man who'd tried to humiliate him. The theater had always been Richard Holden's sanctuary, not the stage itself, though he adored the applause, but the quiet minutes before showtime. Behind the heavy red curtains, he would pace slowly, fingertips grazing the silk lining of his tuxedo jacket, soaking in the silence before the storm of admiration. At 63, his back was a little tighter, his hands a bit stiffer, but the prestige remained. He was, as the press often reminded him, the last of the grand American virtuosos. Tonight was no exception. The Harmony for Hope Gala was upscale, filled with Boston's wealthiest patrons. A Steinway glistened under the spotlight. Richard had been the headliner for 4 years running. He expected nothing less. Still, something felt off. The staff was buzzing, exchanging hushed remarks behind clipboards and tablet screens. His assistant, Carl, was unusually evasive. "There's a special guest performance before your set," he mentioned, eyes flicking toward the hallway. "A last-minute addition," some donor insisted. Richard narrowed his gaze. "A guest performer, who some kid, a blind boy, I think, name's Jamie, came in with his mom. Nobody told me until an hour ago." "A boy, blind," Richard scoffed. "What is this? A publicity stunt?" Carl hesitated. "They say he's good." Richard turned away, brushing dust from his sleeve. "He better be more than good." Backstage, whispers grew louder. A few of the junior musicians peeked around the curtains. "Curious, he's so young," one said, "and he can't see a thing." Another added, "He doesn't even have sheet music, he's just gonna play." Richard overheard it all, his expression carefully neutral, but inside, irritation brewed. He had spent decades perfecting his craft, endless hours of scales, competitions, conservatories, and now, some blind child was going to fumble through a piece on the same stage he'd earned with blood and callous. Minutes later, from the wings, he spotted them, a woman with tired eyes, guiding a boy in a pressed blue shirt toward the piano. The child moved slowly, tapping the floor with his cane, then feeling the instrument's outline like it was sacred. He wasn't nervous, just focused. "Why don't we give our young guest the spotlight?" Richard called out as he stepped on stage, voice light but loaded. A few people clapped politely. The boy didn't react. He simply nodded and sat down. As Richard turned to exit the stage, he glanced back. The boy's fingers hovered above the keys, suspended, as if listening to something only he could hear. And then, with a single note, everything shifted. Jamie Brooks had never seen a grand piano. He'd only touched one once before, during a school fundraiser where they'd let him sit for 2 minutes and press a few keys. But he knew the sound, every note, every pedal, every nuance of the instrument. He could hear a Steinway from a Yamaha with the same ease most people recognized voices. And tonight, he could sense the size of the room, the distance of the ceiling by the way footsteps echoed. It was vast, like a cathedral made of velvet and hush, that his mother held his elbow gently, guiding him down the aisle. The audience whispered, not cruelly, but curiously. Jamie was used to it, ever since the video of him playing on the public piano at Boston Commons had gone viral. Strangers had begun to recognize him. The blind piano boy, they called him online, but tonight felt different. This was formal, serious. He could feel the tension in his mother's grip. "Are you sure you're okay?" she whispered. Jamie nodded. "I know what I want to play." The plan had been for him to open the evening quietly. Just one piece. A warm-up act. Really a gesture from the anonymous donor who had arranged it. But as they reached the stage, a man's voice suddenly echoed from the wings. "Why don't we give our young guests the spotlight?" Jamie froze. He knew that tone, condescending under the mask of kindness. The man's voice was smooth, practiced, and just loud enough for the audience to register the performance. It was the headliner. Holden. Jamie had listened to his recordings 100 times. The man had been a genius once, though in recent years, critics whispered that his soul had left his music long ago. He felt the bench beneath him, plush, expensive, familiar in a way that made his fingers itch. The lights were hot on his face. He didn't speak, didn't smile. He simply placed his hands above the keys, floating in the air like wings about to descend. Then he played. The opening note rang like glass, struck gently by wind. Not dramatic, not showy, just ... pure. A single tone that hummed in the theater's bones. Jamie didn't rush. He let silence answer the sound, then followed it with a chord, soft, rich, aching. The piece wasn't famous. In fact, it was one he'd written himself, a melody that had come to him in dreams, piece by piece, over months. He played as if telling a secret only the piano could understand. In the wings. Richard Holden didn't blink. And halfway through the piece, a woman in the second row began to cry. Richard Holden stood in the shadows, arms crossed tightly over his chest, watching the boy's hands move with eerie precision. It was unnatural, not because Jamie was blind, but because the way he played wasn't learned, it was lived. The boy wasn't performing, he was remembering. That's what struck Richard the most. Jamie never looked up. Of course he didn't, but somehow, it made the moment feel more intimate. The audience wasn't there, the stage wasn't there. It was just the boy and the piano, bound together by something deeper than vision or form. As the melody grew, so did the silence in the room. It wasn't polite, quiet. It was reverent. People stopped breathing, blinking. Some leaned forward unconsciously. The piece wasn't one of Holden's. It wasn't from any recognizable catalog, but it was good. Far too good. And far too ... familiar. Richard's fingers twitched. Something about the phrasing, the rise and fall of a certain progression. He couldn't place it, but it scratched at the back of his mind like a word he couldn't remember. In the third row, a retired music teacher clutched her program, mouthing notes as Jamie played. Two teenagers, who'd only come because their mother dragged them, were recording quietly with their phones. In the balcony, the sound technician lowered his headset and just listened. The piece built slowly, not with grandeur, but with gravity. When Jamie reached the middle section, his left hand moved in an unusual rhythm, sliding slightly off tempo, but not by accident. It gave the melody a heartbeat. It felt like something breaking open, then reassembling itself. Richard recognized that technique. It wasn't taught in conservatories anymore, not since the early 1980s. Only a handful of pianists used it. Only one, in fact, had ever played it during live performances in the Northeast Circuit. Himself. He inhaled sharply, eyes narrowing. Had the boy copied him? Learned it from a bootleg recording? No, the inflection was too organic, too natural. If Jamie had learned it from him, he hadn't just memorized it, he understood it. Jamie finished, not with a bang, but with a breath. The final chord floated, paused, and disappeared like mist. There was a second of absolute stillness. Then, thunderous applause. People stood, some whistled, others clapped with both hands and programs. The woman in the front row sobbed openly. Even those who had come only for Richard Holden found themselves clapping for a boy they didn't know 5 minutes ago. Jamie stood, quietly bowed, and let his mother guide him back into the wings. Richard stepped aside as they passed. Jamie never turned his head. They never exchanged a glance. And yet, Richard felt seen. The ovation lasted nearly 2 full minutes, long after Jamie and his mother had disappeared behind the curtains. People kept clapping, some out of admiration, others simply because they didn't know what else to do. It wasn't just polite encouragement, it was awe, the kind reserved for moments that sneak past the skin and settle somewhere under the ribs. The Harmony for Hope Gala had hosted senators, cellists, and Broadway voices over the years, but never anything like this. A blind boy, barely in his teens, had walked on stage with nothing but a melody in his head and left behind something that felt almost sacred. In the tech booth, a young intern named Devon turned to his supervisor. "We got that recorded, right?" The older man just nodded, eyes still locked on the stage. "We got all of it." Meanwhile, backstage, Jamie stood quietly beside his mother, hands still warm from the keys. He didn't smile. He rarely did after playing. Something about performing left him hollow for a while. Not empty exactly, but used, like he'd poured something out and wasn't sure what would fill the space back up. His mother rubbed his shoulder, whispering, "You were wonderful." He gave the smallest nod. Richard Haldon, standing a few feet away, didn't speak. For the first time in years, he felt unsure about his next steps on stage. How was he supposed to follow that? He walked out slowly when his name was called, his strides still elegant but lacking the quiet arrogance it once held. As he sat at the Steinway, the same bench Jamie had just occupied, he adjusted the seat twice, a habit he hadn't done since his student days. His fingers hovered over the keys. The audience waited, but he began his piece, a dramatic Chopin nocturne, technically flawless, full of flourishes and phrasing, and yet something was missing. The applause at the end was warm but not electric. They admired him, they respected him, but they weren't moved. Later that evening, as guests sipped wine in the lobby and murmured over cheese platters, the only thing anyone talked about was the boy. "Did you see the way he played? He didn't even flinch. It wasn't just music, ... It was like he was telling a story." The event's MC, trying to keep things polished, offered a brief thank you to all performers, but even she stumbled slightly when mentioning Jamie's name, as if the syllables carried more weight than she could comfortably hold. And somewhere among the crowd, a woman in a navy blue coat uploaded a video to social media. Just a clip, 40 seconds of Jamie's solo. She captioned it simply, "This blind boy made a theater full of adults cry tonight. You need to hear this." Within an hour, the views began ticking upward. Richard couldn't sleep that night. He poured himself a glass of scotch, then let it sit, untouched on the windowsill of his apartment overlooking Boston's Back Bay. The skyline twinkled like a polite audience, distant and indifferent. He stood there in his tuxedo slacks and white undershirt, one cuff still fastened, watching the city exhale below, that the music wouldn't leave his head. Jamie's piece, that peculiar phrasing, that slight dissonance in the bridge before resolving into something heartbreakingly clean, haunted him. He paced, replayed it in his mind. It wasn't just that the boy was good. It was that the boy had pulled something out of the piano that Richard hadn't felt in decades. It reminded him of someone, who he crossed to his bookshelf and yanked open a drawer, revealing old programs, photos, dog-eared sheet music with margin scribbles from a different lifetime. He shuffled through them like a man searching for a missing key. Then he found it, a yellowed notebook, nearly falling apart. On the inside cover, a single name written in faded ink, Marvin Kessler. Richard sat down hard. Kessler had been his first real piano teacher, not a formal one, not a Juilliard graduate or conservatory professor. He was a blind jazz pianist who lived above a laundromat in Worcester, Massachusetts. Richard's mother used to drop him off twice a week for lessons when he was a skinny, angry kid with too much talent and not enough patience. Kessler had taught him more than scales and tempo. He'd taught him to feel, to listen for what the notes didn't say. And one afternoon, after Richard had torn through a Liszt etude in record time, Kessler stopped him, mid-phrase, and said, "Speed's not the point, kid. You don't race through grief, you sit in it." It had been over 40 years since he'd heard that voice, and now, tonight, in Jamie's playing, Richard had felt it again. The restraint, the soul behind the technique, the hesitation before resolution. It was uncanny. He picked up his phone, pulled up the viral clip. It already had over 50,000 views, and replayed the section that had struck him deepest. At the 117 mark, Jamie's left hand used a triad inversion that Marvin had shown Richard when he was 15. "Play it like your heart's breaking," Kessler had said. Jamie had played it the same way, but how? Marvin had died in the early 90s. He'd had no children, no students after Richard that he'd mentioned. Richard turned the volume up, leaned in, and whispered aloud, almost involuntarily, "Where did you learn that, kid?" Outside, a siren wailed in the distance. Inside, the old pianist stared at the screen, caught between admiration and an old gnawing grief. The next morning, Richard Holden showed up at the concert hall far earlier than necessary. He claimed it was to thank the staff, but everyone could tell he was there with an agenda. He walked the halls slowly, as if waiting for someone to appear, and eventually, someone did. Jamie's mother, Claire Brooks, was sitting near the box office, sipping from a paper cup of tea, her son leaning quietly against her shoulder with his headphones on. She looked exhausted, but alert. Protective. Richard approached cautiously, hands in his coat pockets. "May I?" he asked, nodding toward the empty seat beside her. She hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, I just wanted to say, your son was extraordinary last night." Claire offered a polite smile. "Thank you. He worked hard." There was an awkward pause. Then Richard leaned in slightly. "I have to ask, the piece he played, did he compose it himself?" Claire looked at him, really looked at him. For the first time, her voice softened, just a notch. "Yes, mostly. Some of it, he heard, not from recordings." "Exactly. Jamie doesn't read music. He learns by ear. He finds old performances online, plays them again and again, until he understands them." Richard's brow furrowed. "He's never had formal lessons." "No, I'm a single mom. Couldn't afford much. He used to listen to old jazz records we picked up at garage sales. Most of them didn't even have sleeves. He just absorbed everything. Especially the ones from someone named Marvin Kessler." The name hit Richard like a dropped hammer. Claire noticed the shift in his expression. "You know that name?" "I knew him," Richard replied quietly. "He taught me, actually, a long time ago." Jamie, still wearing his headphones, pulled one ear off. "Marvin used to play a piece with a broken left-hand rhythm. I've been trying to figure it out for months." Richard turned to him, surprised. "You mean the walking inversion?" Jamie nodded. "It's tricky. I heard it once, in a video from the 70s. Only about 10 seconds of it survived, but I knew there was more." A strange sensation crept through Richard's chest. He wasn't sure if it was pride or something more painful. "That technique hasn't been played publicly in decades." Jamie tilted his head. "I didn't know that." Claire stepped in. "He's just always been drawn to it. It's like he's remembering something he never lived." Richard didn't speak for a moment. Then, with a faint smile, he said, "I think you might be right." Just then, a stagehand interrupted them with a clipboard. "Mr. Holden, we need you for rehearsal." As Richard stood, he looked back at Jamie. "Would you mind playing something for me after, just us, in the green room?" Jamie nodded. "I'd like that." The green room smelled faintly of pine cleaner and old velvet. It hadn't changed in decades. Same creaky leather couch, same gold-framed photos of past performers lining the walls. Richard sat in the armchair opposite the piano, watching Jamie's fingers glide across the keys, searching not for notes, but for something more elusive, texture, truth. The boy wasn't playing for show. He was testing sounds, feeling for meaning. "Try the lower F sharp," Richard said gently. Jamie adjusted, pressed the key, and let it ring. "There," Richard murmured. "Now walk it up half a step." "No, not straight. Slide into it. Don't be polite." Jamie did it again, this time with more friction. More bite. Richard closed his eyes. That was Marvin's sound. He let the silence hang between them, thick as smoke. Then, he cleared his throat. "I never told anyone this, but when I was your age, I hated music. Or maybe, I hated how music was taught. My father wanted me to be precise, mechanical. He thought perfection was the point." Jamie kept playing quietly, listening. "And then I met Marvin," Richard continued. "He was blind like you, lived above a laundromat. First lesson, he asked me what I felt, not what I heard, what I felt. I thought it was a trick question." Jamie smiled faintly. "Every Tuesday and Friday for 3 years, Richard said. He never charged me a dime, just asked me to listen. And then one day, I stopped going. I got a scholarship to a fancy conservatory. I left without saying goodbye." Claire had entered the room during the conversation, and now stood quietly by the door. Her face softened as Richard spoke. "He died a year later," Richard added, voice tight, "and I never played the way he taught me again. Not really. I traded soul for applause." Jamie stopped playing. "That's why you didn't like my playing at first," he said. Because it reminded you of something you lost. Richard's throat tightened. Maybe. Or maybe it reminded me of what I threw away. Claire stepped forward. Jamie's always said music talks to him. I used to think it was just his imagination. But when he plays, sometimes it's like something else is speaking through him. Richard stood, walked over, and rested a hand on Jamie's shoulder. It's not imagination, it's memory. Marvin's mine, maybe even your own, from somewhere deeper than thought. The boy tilted his head. Do you think music can carry a person forward? Richard looked into the distance, as if scanning time itself. Yes, he said softly, and sometimes it can carry someone back. By the end of the week, the video of Jamie's performance had reached over 3 million views. News outlets picked it up, calling him the boy who humbled a master. Headlines varied in tone, some admiring, others more biting. Prodigy outshines legend at Boston Gala, blind teens piano stuns. Halden left in the shadows, grace in silence. A new star rises. Richard read each article. Every word stung, not because they were wrong, but because they weren't. The gala organizers called him to discuss next steps. Sponsors wanted a joint appearance, Jamie and Halden, side by side, for the season's closing concert. At first, Richard resisted. It felt performative, forced. But then he remembered something Marvin used to say, when you've broken something in public, don't fix it in private. So he agreed. At the press conference, Richard wore a charcoal gray suit and a plain tie. Jamie sat beside him, not fidgeting, just listening. The cameras clicked. A reporter asked the inevitable, "Mr. Halden, how did it feel to be upstaged?" He chuckled softly, nodding. "I deserved it." There was a pause. Then he leaned toward the microphone. "I've spent decades performing. I've stood in concert halls from Vienna to Tokyo, but last week, I was reminded of something I'd long forgotten. Music isn't about polish, it's about honesty. And that boy over there," he gestured to Jamie, "played with more truth in 5 minutes than I have in the last 5 years." A quiet ripple moved through the room. "I tried to dismiss him," Richard added, voice tightening. "I tried to humiliate him, even it was subtle, polite, but it was arrogance, and I regret it." After the conference, as the crowd thinned, Jamie and Richard walked side by side down the theater's corridor. Their steps were slow. Neither rushed. "You didn't have to say all that," Jamie said. "People would have moved on." "I didn't say it for them," Richard replied. "I said it for me." Later that night, Richard found himself at Marvin Kessler's old building in Worcester. The laundromat was gone, replaced by a vape shop, but the upstairs window that was still there. He stood across the street, hands in his coat pockets, letting the cold air bite his skin. He whispered, "I found him, Marvin, or maybe ... he found me." The final concert of the season was held in a packed theater, with standing room only, and a live stream running across 3 major platforms. But the atmosphere wasn't one of celebrity, it was reverence. The crowd wasn't just here for music. They were here for something rarer, redemption. Backstage, Jamie sat quietly, fingers poised just above his lap. He wasn't nervous, but he was ... still, centered. His mother gave his hand a squeeze and whispered, "Whatever happens out there, you've already given the world something beautiful." Richard entered the dressing room just before a curtain. He looked different, not younger, but lighter, like a man who'd dropped something heavy he'd carried for far too long. "Ready?" he asked Jamie. "Are you?" Jamie replied with a grin. They walked out together. The applause began the moment they stepped into view, but it wasn't deafening. It was warm, real, as if the audience understood that this moment wasn't about showmanship. It was about connection. Richard sat on the left side of the bench, Jamie on the right. No sheet music, no introduction. Just silence. Then, 4 hands moved as one. They started with a piece Jamie had written, rearranged for duet. The melody was simple, but elegant, a motif that echoed Jamie's first performance, now layered with richer harmonies. Richard adapted instinctively, answering Jamie's phrasing like a conversation between old souls. At one point, Richard drifted into a Kessler progression, that broken left-hand rhythm, and Jamie followed without missing a beat, weaving it into the fabric of the song as if it had always belonged there. The audience leaned forward. No one coughed, no phones clicked, just breathless, collective listening. By the time the final note faded, a few people were crying openly. And for a long moment, neither pianist moved. Then Richard looked out into the crowd and said softly, I used to think music was about being the best. Tonight, I learned it's about becoming yourself and letting others do the same. He turned to Jamie. Thank you for reminding me. Jamie smiled. Thank you for listening. They stood, bowed, and held the moment, not like performers, but like people who had finally found each other in a world built to keep them apart. That night, as the theater emptied and the live stream replayed for millions more, people didn't talk about the performance as a triumph or a scandal. They called it what it was, a moment of grace.
If you've made it this far, it means this story touched you in some way. So don't leave without subscribing. It really helps the channel and keeps me motivated to share more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And which part of this story moved you the most?